Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the entrance. The voice was sharp, authoritative, borderline hostile. Retired Marine Sergeant David Stone Alvarez blinked against the sunlight, turning slightly toward the source. A young officer badge, gleaming hand resting on his belt, stood just a few feet away, eyes narrowed. "This is a private funeral," Alvarez said slowly, voice gruff but measured. "My wife's funeral." Officer Ryan Caldwell didn't budge. "We had a report of a suspicious individual loitering. I need to see some ID." Alvarez looked down at himself, black suit, polished shoes, ribbons pinned to his chest. His Marine Corps tie clip caught a glint of the sun. Suspicious. He felt like the last standing wall of a burned house. He let out a slow breath, trying to steady the pressure crawling up his spine. The PTSD meds hadn't kicked in yet, and his palms were slick with sweat. But the officer was still staring, hands still on the taser. The distance between grief and threat was shrinking fast. An hour earlier, Alvarez had walked into St. Andrew's Church flanked by his two teenage sons, his shoulders squared despite the tremor in his chest. The pews were packed with people, neighbors, family, and more Marines in dress blues than the church had likely seen in years. The casket at the front was draped in the flag. Mariah Alvarez, his wife of 24 years, had finally lost her battle with cancer. And David Stone, as his men still called him, was trying not to lose his grip on reality. It wasn't combat that had done it. Not the blast in Kandahar, not the firefight in Sangin, not even the night he lost half his squad to an IED. It was this: saying goodbye to the woman who had anchored him through every storm. He lasted 37 minutes inside. The priest was mid-sermon when the walls began closing in tight collar, too many faces oxygen thinning. Stone quietly stepped outside. Just 5 minutes, just to breathe. Just to remember how. He never expected a police officer to be waiting by the steps. Now facing the growing tension on the sunlit sidewalk, Alvarez spoke carefully. "My ID is in my coat pocket. I'm going to reach for it slowly." But Caldwell's voice cut in fast. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The moment splintered grief, weaponized by misunderstanding silence, mistaken for threat. And inside the church, 27 Marines were seated in the fourth and fifth pews. They would soon hear the commotion. They would step out, and Officer Ryan Caldwell would learn that David Alvarez was never alone. Not in life, and especially not in mourning. Officer Ryan Caldwell's hand hovered just above his taser as he took another step forward, voice sharp with authority he hadn't earned. "I'm not going to ask again. Show me your hands and step away from the church." Retired Marine Sergeant David Stone Alvarez remained still, his jaw clenched not in defiance but in restraint. He had buried brothers in arms across the world. But this was the hardest day of his life. The folded flag sitting beside his wife's casket inside that church was proof enough. "I told you," he said slowly, evenly. "I'm just getting some air. My wife is being laid to rest right now. I'm not causing any trouble." Caldwell's eyes narrowed. His rookie instincts read Alvarez's size, the gravel in his voice, and the PTSD twitching in his fingers as threats, not trauma. "You match a report, man loitering, possibly intoxicated." "I need to see some ID, now." Alvarez hesitated for a breath. He could feel it happening in the slow burn that always came before the storm. He nodded and said quietly, "It's in my coat pocket. I'm reaching slowly." But Caldwell was already on edge. His grip tightened on the taser. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked. A few passers-by across the street paused, sensing the tension in the air. Alvarez froze mid-motion, arms still at his sides, lips pursed to stay composed. "Officer," he said, "I'm not your enemy. I just buried the love of my life. I'm reaching for my wallet. That's all." He moved slowly, deliberately toward his coat. The moment his hand dipped beneath the fabric, Caldwell's voice cracked. "I said, don't move," click. The trigger snapped. Crack, the twin metal prongs of the taser slammed into Alvarez's chest, electricity ripping through his body. His legs gave out. He collapsed backwards, his head striking the bottom stair of the church with a sickening thud. Gasps came from the parking lot. Someone screamed. But Caldwell didn't holster his weapon. He stepped forward, shouting commands at a man who was now unconscious, twitching on concrete. Inside the sanctuary, a tremor ran through the pews. The sound of chaos leaked through stained glass, muffled yells, gasps the unmistakable pulse of conflict. One Marine stood, then another, then a third. Staff Sergeant Rachel Yoon turned toward the window and spotted Alvarez's collapsed figure. "He's down," she said, her voice tight. That was all it took. 30 Marines in dress blues stood in unison. No one gave an order, they didn't need one. Bonds forged in war didn't require commands. They filed silently toward the doors, led by Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Wells, Alvarez's former squad leader. By the time they reached the steps, the scene had frozen. Caldwell stood alone, taser still, drawn, panic flickering in his eyes as the Marines surrounded him in a tight arc. Alvarez lay motionless, a dark patch spreading on his shirt where his temple had split on the stair. The silence was suffocating. "Step away from him," Wells said quietly, his voice low but loaded. "Now." Caldwell turned, saw them 30 battle-hardened Marines, their shoulders squared, eyes locked. Not yelling, not threatening, just waiting. "Back off," Caldwell ordered, his voice cracking with the pressure of his collapsing authority. He was resisting. He fit a description. Wells didn't blink. That man just lost his wife. He stepped outside for air. "And you put him on the ground in front of her casket." "Protocol, protocol," another Marine echoed bitterly. "That's a Purple Heart recipient, a man who took a bullet so you could carry that badge. And you tased him." More officers arrived, but they didn't approach. They paused at the perimeter, absorbing what they saw: 30 Marines standing between one of their own and the man who dropped him. Caldwell finally lowered his taser, but it was too late. Cell phones were already recording. Churchgoers stood frozen on the steps. Maria Alvarez's family watched in shock, and as medics pushed through to reach Alvarez, Miguel, his 18-year-old son, dropped to his knees beside him, whispering, "Dad, you're safe. We're right here." It was no longer just about a misunderstanding. It was about honor, about grief, about a line crossed too far and 30 Marines who had no intention of letting it go unanswered. The moment David Stone Alvarez hit the pavement, convulsing from the blast of Officer Ryan Caldwell's taser, everything shifted. Inside the church, the soft cadence of Father Alvarez's eulogy halted as gasps rippled through the pews. The commotion outside had shattered the somber stillness. Marines who had once served under Alvarez, now older, grayer, but still warriors, rose from their seats in unison, their dress blues rippling like battle flags. Gunnery Sergeant Tanya Iron Collins was the first through the double doors. Her jaw locked the second she saw Alvarez sprawled on the steps. Without a word, she descended them, heels clicking like gunfire against the stone. Behind her, Master Sergeant Marcus "Top" Franklin followed, his eyes scanning the situation with practiced precision. 28 more Marines moved into formation behind them, years of battlefield conditioning driving every step. Officer Caldwell, still gripping his taser, took an instinctive step back. His rookie confidence fractured the moment the first Marine closed in. "Back up," he barked, his voice breaking. He resisted. "I had to act." "Resisted," Iron Collins growled, eyes narrowing. "You just tased a Purple Heart recipient at his wife's funeral." "That's not law enforcement. That's disgrace." Top Franklin knelt beside Alvarez, motioning for the others to secure the perimeter. "Stone, it's Top. You're safe. Breathe, brother." But Alvarez wasn't hearing him. His eyes were buoyant and vacant. His limbs trembled. The electricity had triggered more than physical pain. It had ripped open old wounds. In his mind, he was no longer in San Diego. He was back in Fallujah, back in smoke, back in fire. "Incoming," Alvarez gasped, clawing at the pavement as if to crawl behind cover. "Stay down, McCready's." "Hit no stone," Top said firmly. "You're home. You're safe. Look at me." But it wasn't Top who broke through. It was a voice from the crowd, soft, trembling, familiar. "Daddy." A girl pushed past the gathered Marine's ponytail, bouncing, tears streaking her face. 17-year-old Isabel Alvarez fell to her knees beside her father, taking his hand with both of hers. "Daddy, it's me. It's Izzy. You're not in combat. You're at Mom's funeral. I'm here. We all are." Something shifted behind Alvarez's eyes. His breathing slowed, his gaze locked on hers. Recognition broke through the fog like dawn. "Izzy," he rasped. "I'm here, Daddy. You're safe." Officer Caldwell, still standing nearby, looked stunned. His taser now hung at his side like a stone. Around him, the Marines had formed a silent perimeter, no weapons drawn, no threats made, but every face carried the same unflinching expression: one wrong move, and things would change. Police backup arrived within minutes. 3 patrol cars skidded to a stop, tires screeching. 7 more officers emerged, hands near holsters, scanning the scene. But what they found was not a riot, just 30 Marines standing shoulder to shoulder guarding a man who had once led them through hell. Lieutenant Evans, the responding supervisor, stepped forward cautiously. His eyes flicked from the taser on the ground to the unconscious expressions of disbelief on his officers' faces. "Caldwell," he said sharply, "what the hell happened here?" He wouldn't comply. Caldwell stammered. "He was acting erratic, I thought. You tased a grieving Marine sergeant outside his wife's funeral." Evans barked. While 30 of his brothers sat inside the church, before Caldwell could answer, Iron Collins stepped forward. "We are showering. You've got 30 combat veterans here who watched your officer assault one of our own without cause. This won't end with an apology." Evans held up both hands. "We need to de-escalate immediately." "You should have thought of that 5 minutes ago," Top Franklin replied. Alvarez, now upright but leaning heavily on his daughter, glanced around with hollow eyes. His chest bore fresh burns from the taser. His dress uniform was soiled. But his voice, quiet, broken, cut through the air like steel. "I came out here to breathe," he said. "Not to fight, but I'll be damned if I let my wife's funeral become another battlefield." The Marines stayed where they were, still, silent, unmoving. And for the first time, Officer Caldwell understood he hadn't tased just a man. He had tased a Marine, a brother, a symbol, and 30 more had come to remind him what that still meant. Officer Ryan Caldwell barely had time to register the shift in atmosphere before the ground beneath him seemed to tilt. 30 Marines in dress blues, combat-hardened, disciplined, and united, stood like a wall between him and the man he had just dropped with 50,000 volts. Their expressions were unreadable, their movements precise. But beneath the surface was a fury no less potent than any battlefield adrenaline. Gunnery Sergeant Tanya Iron Collins stepped forward. First, eyes locked on Caldwell. Her voice was calm but laced with steel. "You tased Sergeant Alvarez at his wife's funeral." Caldwell opened his mouth, but the words fumbled. He was reaching. "You thought wrong," growled Master Sergeant Marcus Top Franklin as he took his place beside her. "You mistook grief for threat. You mistook a Marine for a suspect." But it was the sound of approaching sirens that broke the standoff. 3 more patrol cars skidded to a halt near the church steps. Doors flew open. Officers poured out, hands near holsters, uncertainty in their stances. From one of the cars stepped Lieutenant Mark Reynolds. He wasn't young, and he didn't carry himself like a man hungry for control. His steps were deliberate. His eyes scanned the scene quickly, taking in the tased veteran, still trembling on the ground, the 30 Marines in flawless formation, and his own officers standing frozen in the shadow of what was clearly a catastrophic failure in judgment. "Stand down!" Reynolds ordered his officers without raising his voice. Now they obeyed. Hands fell away from weapons. Tension dropped by half. Reynolds approached slowly, hands open until he stood before Top Franklin. "Master Sergeant," he said with professional courtesy, "I'm Lieutenant Reynolds. I served 2 tours before joining the department. I understand what I'm looking at here." Top gave him a curt nod. "Then you understand we're not the threat." "I do," Reynolds replied. He turned slightly to address everyone present. "I've already reviewed the radio call. I know this didn't start as a riot. It started with a man grieving." He looked down at Alvarez, still on one knee, his chest heaving, as his teenage daughter Lily knelt beside him, one hand on his shoulder, grounding him. Sergeant Alvarez, Reynolds said gently, "I'm sorry this happened. No one in uniform should ever be treated like this. Not here. Not today." Stone slowly looked up, the fury in his eyes dimming into something closer to heartbreak. "I was just trying to say goodbye." Reynolds nodded solemnly and turned to one of his officers. "Get Caldwell out of here. He's relieved of duty, effective immediately. Internal Affairs will handle the rest." Caldwell, still defiant but noticeably shaken, started to protest. "Lieutenant, I followed procedure. You followed fear." Reynolds snapped, the veteran tone in his voice, slicing through any remaining ego. "And you disgraced this badge doing it. Now get in the car. As Caldwell was escorted away, the scene shifted. What had moments before teetered on the brink of confrontation began to resemble something far different. Reynolds looked to Top. "May I make a request?" Top raised an eyebrow. "Let us help escort him back in. Not as cops, as men who respect service. Let's honor her properly." Top hesitated, then nodded once. "Dress formation," Gunnery Sergeant Collins ordered, and the Marines responded instantly. On the other side, Reynolds turned to his remaining officers. "Line up." Side by side, police officers and Marines formed a joint honor guard, an image none of the attendees would ever forget. The line parted for Sergeant Alvarez and his daughter as they slowly walked back toward the church doors, supported by Bulldog Chen and Top Franklin. Lily held her father's hand. His steps were shaky, but his spine remained straight. Inside the church, the congregation had been watching through the stained glass windows. As the doors opened and the procession entered, the crowd stood. A hushed reverence blanketed the pews. David Stone Alvarez, bruised and broken, but never bowed, walked past his wife's casket with the dignity that had defined him through war and loss. He turned toward the pulpit and took his place behind it, hands trembling only slightly. "I came here today to bury the woman who brought me home from every war," he began, voice hoarse but steady. "What happened outside? That wasn't supposed to be part of this. But maybe it was. Maybe it reminded us all what honor really means. Not in medals, not in uniforms, but in how we show up for each other." Outside, someone had recorded the moment the Marines had formed their line. Within hours, the video was everywhere across social media, news stations, veteran forums. The image of Marines and police officers standing shoulder to shoulder, escorting a grieving brother into his wife's funeral, ignited a nationwide conversation. Justice for Stone began trending before the sun set, and the world began to take notice not just of what went wrong, but of what was made right when courage, accountability, and brotherhood showed up at the gates of grief. The footage of Marines and police officers forming a joint honor guard reverberated far beyond the church in San Diego. Within 72 hours, it had been viewed over 15 million times. Cable news anchors debated the moment. Lawmakers watched it on loop. And across the country, police departments began asking a new question: how do we keep this from ever happening again? David Stone Alvarez never asked for the spotlight, but the world wouldn't let go. In the weeks that followed, the public pressure turned into policy. California became the first state to introduce mandatory veteran sensitivity training for all law enforcement officers. Soon after, a federal bill nicknamed the Alvarez Act was introduced, calling for nationwide military cultural awareness programs in police academies. But Stone wasn't done. He used the momentum to launch the Stone Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting Gold Star families, advocating for PTSD awareness, and creating practical training materials for first responders interacting with veterans. What began as a local effort in San Diego quickly grew into a national movement. Police chiefs consulted his team. Military families leaned on his resources, and his story was taught in training sessions from Baltimore to Boise. 6 months after the funeral, a memorial was unveiled at the base of the hill, where Maria Alvarez now rested, a granite arch etched with her name, surrounded by a field of white lilies and small American flags. Hundreds gathered for the dedication. Stone stepped up to the podium in a pressed black suit. His hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. Then he spoke words that had been forming since the day he was tased, words that would define the movement. "The best of America happens when good people stand up for what's right, whether in dress blues or a badge." Maria believed that, and so do I. The crowd stood in solemn silence, some saluting, others wiping tears. The legacy of that day no longer belonged only to the tragedy, it belonged to the change it sparked. In a world quick to judge and slow to understand, it's easy to see uniforms and forget the people who wear them. But real change happens when courage meets compassion, when strangers become protectors and pain is turned into purpose.